On October 13, 2001, the discovery that would shatter Millfield, Michigan wasn't made by search teams or police officers, but by 11-year-old Tommy Walsh, who was skipping stones at Miller's Creek at 7:23 a.m. The boy's piercing scream brought his father running through the morning mist, only to find Jake Morrison's silver 1999 Ford Mustang sitting perfectly positioned at the water's edge, engine cold, doors locked from the inside, windows rolled up tight. But Jake Morrison, Millfield High's star quarterback who had thrown for 2,847 yards and led the Wildcats to their first state championship in 23 years, was nowhere to be found. The car keys dangled from the ignition. Jake's wallet sat untouched in the center console, containing $127 in cash and his fake ID that had gotten him into Murphy's bar just 8 hours earlier. His Letterman jacket hung neatly on the passenger seat headrest, positioned with the same precision he applied to every spiral he'd ever thrown. The radio was tuned to 104.7 FM, the classic rock station that Jake had programmed as preset number 1 since getting his license 2 years earlier. Everything appeared normal, except for one detail that would haunt investigators for the next 20 years. Jake's size 12. Nike cleats sat on the driver's side floor mat, laces still tied, as if he'd simply stepped out of them and vanished into thin air. If you've been following cases like this, you know how crucial these first moments become. Make sure you're subscribed, because what we uncover gets more disturbing with each revelation. Detective Ray Coleman had seen his share of missing persons cases during his 15 years with the Millfield Police Department, but something about Jake Morrison's disappearance felt different from the moment he arrived at Miller's Creek. The 42-year-old investigator had grown up in Millfield, had watched Jake play since his freshman year, and understood that kids like Jake Morrison didn't just disappear. They got full scholarships to Michigan State, married their high school sweethearts, and came back to coach the next generation of Wildcat quarterbacks. They didn't abandon their cars by creek beds on homecoming weekend. The timeline that Coleman reconstructed from witness statements painted a picture of a celebration that had turned into a nightmare. Homecoming 2001 had been everything Millfield High could have hoped for. A 35-14 victory over their crosstown rivals, the East Side Eagles, with Jake throwing 4 touchdown passes and rushing for another 89 yards. The post-game celebration at Murphy's bar had attracted half the town, including parents, teachers, and graduates who'd driven in from Detroit and Grand Rapids to watch their golden boy cement his legend. Jake had arrived at Murphy's around 10:30 p.m., still wearing his grass-stained uniform pants and the championship ring from the previous year's state title. Witnesses remembered him being in exceptional spirits, talking about college scouts from Notre Dame and Ohio State who'd been in the stands, and joking with teammates about their upcoming playoff run. The bartender, Mickey Torres, later told investigators that Jake had nursed 2 beers over 3 hours, far from intoxicated when he left the bar at 1:47 a.m. The drive from Murphy's bar to Jake's family home on Elm Street should have taken exactly 12 minutes along Route 34, a straight stretch of 2-lane highway that Jake had driven hundreds of times. But Miller's Creek, where his car was discovered, sat 3 miles in the opposite direction down a gravel access road that local fishermen used to reach prime bass fishing spots. No one could explain why Jake would have driven there, especially at 2 a.m. on an October night when temperatures had dropped to 38 degrees. Jake's parents, David and Margaret Morrison, received the call from Detective Coleman at 8:15 a.m., just as Margaret was preparing Sunday breakfast, and David was reviewing game film from the previous night's victory. The news that their son's car had been found abandoned struck them with the force of a linebacker's hit. David, who coached the defensive line at Millfield High and had been Jake's first football mentor, immediately drove to Miller's Creek with the desperate hope that this was some kind of misunderstanding, that Jake would be sitting on a log somewhere nursing a hangover and feeling embarrassed about falling asleep in his car. But one look at the Mustang, positioned so precisely at the water's edge with its rear bumper exactly parallel to the shoreline, told David everything he needed to know. Jake hadn't driven there voluntarily. Someone had placed that car with mechanical precision, someone who'd wanted it found but not too quickly, someone who understood the psychology of a search operation well enough to create maximum confusion and misdirection. The initial investigation revealed details that transformed Jake's disappearance from a missing persons case into something far more sinister. Crime scene technicians discovered that the car's odometer showed exactly 47,000 332 miles. But Jake's meticulous maintenance records indicated it should have read 47,298 miles based on his known driving patterns. Someone had driven the Mustang an additional 34 miles after Jake had last been seen leaving Murphy's bar, a distance that could have taken them to any number of remote locations within a 20-mile radius of Millfield. More disturbing was the discovery of a single drop of blood on the driver's seat, barely visible but detectable under luminol testing. The blood matched Jake's type, A positive, but 2001 DNA technology couldn't determine whether it definitively came from him or from another individual with the same blood type. The positioning of the blood drop suggested it had fallen from above, possibly from a head wound, but the lack of additional blood evidence indicated that any violence had occurred elsewhere. Detective Coleman's investigation quickly focused on the obvious suspects: rival players who might have harbored resentment over Jake's success, jealous boyfriends of girls who'd shown interest in the star quarterback, or college recruits who saw Jake as an obstacle to their own athletic ambitions. But each lead dissolved under scrutiny. Jake's teammates uniformly described him as generous and humble, someone who shared credit for victories and took responsibility for defeats. His girlfriend, Ashley Chen, had been at her cousin's wedding in Cleveland all weekend, with cell phone records and photographs confirming her alibi. The rival players from East Side High had all been accounted for at their own post-game celebrations. The case that would consume Coleman's career for the next 2 decades was just beginning, but already the detective sensed he was dealing with something unprecedented in Millfield's quiet history. Jake Morrison hadn't simply walked away from his life. He'd been removed from it with a precision that suggested careful planning and intimate knowledge of both his habits and the local geography. Someone had been watching Jake, studying him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The search for Jake Morrison began at dawn on October 14th, with over 200 volunteers spreading across Millfield's 847 square miles of farmland, forests, and recreational areas. Margaret Morrison had organized the effort with the same methodical approach she applied to her job as head librarian at Millfield Public Library, creating search grids, assigning team leaders, and establishing communication protocols that impressed even seasoned law enforcement officers. David Morrison led the search team that focused on Miller's Creek and the surrounding watershed, following the waterway for miles in both directions, while volunteers on both banks called Jake's name into the morning air. The creek meandered through dense woods and agricultural fields before joining the Huron River 15 miles downstream, creating countless locations where evidence might have been disposed of or where Jake himself might be found. But it was the search of Jake's bedroom that provided the investigation's first major breakthrough. Hidden beneath his mattress, Detective Coleman discovered a composition notebook filled with Jake's handwriting that documented incidents he'd never reported to police, parents, or coaches. The entries, dating back to his sophomore year, described a pattern of escalating harassment that painted a very different picture of Jake's high school experience than the one his public persona suggested. The notebook revealed that Jake had been receiving threatening letters since the beginning of his junior year, messages that began with generic criticisms of his playing style but had evolved into detailed threats against his family and girlfriend. The letters weren't signed, but Jake's notes indicated they were delivered to his locker, left on his car windshield, and occasionally slipped under his bedroom window during the night. He'd kept every letter, storing them in a shoebox that Coleman found in Jake's closet, creating an archive of malice that spanned nearly 2 years. The threats had intensified significantly after Millfield's state championship victory the previous December. The letters began referencing specific details about Jake's daily routine, his class schedule, his part-time job at Morrison Hardware, his father's store, and even his girlfriend's work shifts at the local movie theater. Someone had been conducting surveillance on Jake with the dedication of a professional stalker, documenting his movements with enough precision to know exactly when and where he'd be vulnerable. One letter, dated just 3 weeks before Jake's disappearance, contained information that chilled Detective Coleman to his core. "I know you drive past Miller's Creek every Tuesday when you visit your grandmother at Sunset Manor. I know you stop at Murphy's after big games. I know your parents go to bed at 10:30 and your girlfriend works late shifts on weekends. I know everything about you, Jake Morrison, and soon everyone will know what you really are." The revelation that Jake's grandmother lived at Sunset Manor, which required a drive past Miller's Creek via the same gravel access road where his car was found, suggested that his disappearance wasn't random, but rather the culmination of extensive planning by someone who'd studied his patterns with obsessive attention to detail. The stalker had chosen the location deliberately, using Jake's own routine against him in a way that demonstrated intimate knowledge of his weekly activities. Coleman's investigation into the threatening letters consumed weeks of forensic analysis that yielded frustratingly little concrete evidence. The paper was standard notebook stock available at any office supply store. The ink came from ballpoint pens that could be purchased anywhere, and the handwriting showed signs of deliberate disguise that made graphological analysis nearly impossible. But the content of the letters revealed psychological insights that helped Coleman begin building a profile of Jake's stalker. The author demonstrated detailed knowledge of football strategy and terminology, suggesting either a current or former player with extensive experience in the sport. References to specific plays that Jake had executed during games indicated someone who attended Millfield High contests regularly and paid close attention to Jake's individual performance. Most telling were subtle details about the internal dynamics of the Millfield High football program, information that would only be available to someone with access to the team environment. The breakthrough came when Coleman noticed that several letters contained references to plays and strategies that hadn't been used in games but had been practiced during closed scrimmages that were limited to team members, coaches, and a small number of boosters who helped fund the program. The author's knowledge of these practice sessions narrowed the suspect pool significantly, focusing Coleman's investigation on individuals who had legitimate access to team activities but harbored resentment toward Jake's success. Coleman's suspect list initially included 17 individuals who met the criteria for access and opportunity, ranging from assistant coaches to senior players who'd lost starting positions to Jake's superior abilities. But as the investigation progressed, one name began appearing with increasing frequency in witness statements and background research: Tommy Brennan, the 34-year-old defensive coordinator who'd been passed over for the head coaching position that ultimately went to an outside candidate from Grand Rapids. Brennan had been a standout player at Millfield High during the 1980s, earning all-state honors as a linebacker before a knee injury ended his college career at Central Michigan University. He'd returned to Millfield in 1995 with aspirations of eventually taking over the football program, working as an assistant coach while completing his education degree through night classes at a nearby community college. But despite 6 years of dedicated service and intimate knowledge of Millfield's football tradition, the school board had chosen to hire Mark Stevens, a younger coach with a master's degree and experience at larger schools. The decision had devastated Brennan both professionally and personally, creating a sense of betrayal that he'd never fully concealed from colleagues and players. Several witnesses told Coleman that Brennan had made increasingly bitter comments about the direction of the football program under Stevens' leadership, particularly criticizing the emphasis placed on star players like Jake Morrison at the expense of team development and character building. More significantly, Brennan's coaching responsibilities gave him access to all the information contained in the threatening letters: practice schedules, play formations, team travel plans, and personal details about players that he'd gathered through his role as defensive coordinator. His position also provided cover for the surveillance activities that the stalker had conducted, since coaches routinely observed players in various settings as part of their evaluation and mentoring responsibilities. Coleman's investigation into Brennan's background revealed a pattern of boundary violations and inappropriate behavior that had been overlooked or excused by school administrators who valued his football knowledge and local connections. Several former players reported that Brennan had made them uncomfortable with personal questions about their family situations, social activities, and relationships with teammates. Parents had occasionally complained about Brennan showing up unannounced at their homes or businesses, ostensibly to discuss their son's athletic development, but often lingering for conversations that seemed to serve no clear purpose. The psychological pressure of being investigated began affecting Brennan's behavior in ways that attracted additional scrutiny from both law enforcement and school officials. His attendance at practice sessions became erratic, his interactions with players grew increasingly hostile, and his performance during games deteriorated as he struggled to focus on his defensive coordinator responsibilities. The school board placed him on administrative leave in November 2001, citing concerns about his emotional stability and effectiveness as an educator. But despite mounting circumstantial evidence and growing suspicions within the community, Coleman lacked the concrete proof necessary to arrest Brennan for Jake's disappearance. The threatening letters couldn't be definitively linked to Brennan through handwriting analysis, fingerprint evidence, or DNA testing. His alibi for the night of October 13th was weak but not impossible. He claimed to have been home alone watching game film, a story that couldn't be corroborated but also couldn't be disproven. The case reached a frustrating stalemate by the spring of 2002, with Coleman convinced of Brennan's guilt but unable to build a prosecutable case. Jake Morrison remained missing. His family continued their agonizing wait for answers, and Thomas Brennan moved to Arizona, where he found work as a high school security guard, far from the football program that had defined his identity and ultimately destroyed his life in Millfield, Michigan. The investigation that had consumed Detective Coleman's every waking moment for 6 months seemed destined to join the growing collection of unsolved cases that haunted rural police departments across the Midwest. But technology and time would eventually provide the tools necessary to solve Jake Morrison's disappearance in ways that no one could have anticipated in 2001. Margaret Morrison's transformation from small-town librarian to obsessed investigator began on the 6-month anniversary of Jake's disappearance, when she realized that Detective Coleman's official investigation had essentially stalled. The police department's resources were limited, other cases demanded attention, and the trail was growing colder with each passing day. If Jake was going to be found, Margaret decided, she would have to find him herself. The basement of the Morrison family's ranch home on Elm Street became Margaret's command center, its paneled walls soon covered with maps, photographs, timeline charts, and copies of every document related to Jake's case that she could obtain through official channels or personal relationships. She converted David's old pool table into a work surface where she spread evidence and organized leads with the same systematic approach she'd used to catalog thousands of books during her 20-year career at the library. Margaret's daily routine began at 5:30 a.m., with coffee and review of any new information she'd gathered the previous day, followed by phone calls to law enforcement agencies in neighboring counties to check on possible sightings or developments in similar cases. She'd created a database of every missing persons case involving young men between the ages of 16 and 25 within a 200-mile radius of Millfield, looking for patterns that might connect Jake's disappearance to other unsolved crimes. The work was methodical and often heartbreaking, requiring Margaret to maintain detailed files on families torn apart by unexplained disappearances while struggling with her own grief and the growing strain on her marriage. David had initially supported her investigative efforts, but as months turned into years and Margaret's obsession consumed more of their family resources and emotional energy, he began urging her to accept that Jake might never be found and to focus on rebuilding their lives. But Margaret couldn't abandon the search. Not when she'd discovered discrepancies in the official investigation that suggested important leads had been overlooked or inadequately pursued. Her librarian's training in research methodology had taught her to question sources, verify information, and look for connections that might not be immediately obvious to others. Applied to criminal investigation, these skills revealed gaps in Detective Coleman's work that troubled her deeply. The most significant oversight involved Thomas Brennan's employment history prior to his arrival in Millfield. Coleman had focused primarily on Brennan's activities and behavior after he'd been hired as defensive coordinator, but Margaret's research into his background revealed a pattern of job changes and relocations that suggested a much more complex and troubling history. Brennan had worked at 4 different high schools in 3 states between 1995 and his hiring at Millfield in 1999, a pattern of mobility that was unusual for teachers and coaches who typically built long-term relationships within their communities. Margaret obtained employment records from each school and discovered that Brennan's departures had coincided with complaints from parents and students about inappropriate behavior, though none of the allegations had resulted in formal charges or disciplinary actions. More disturbing was Margaret's discovery that 2 other high school football players had gone missing from towns where Brennan had previously worked. Kevin Walsh had disappeared from his home in Traverse City in 1997 during Brennan's tenure as an assistant coach there, and Marcus Johnson had vanished from a team party in Kalamazoo in 1998, just months before Brennan left that position. Neither case had been solved, and neither investigation had identified Brennan as a suspect or person of interest. The parallels between these disappearances and Jake's case were striking enough to convince Margaret that she'd identified a serial predator who'd been operating across Michigan for years without detection. All 3 victims were star athletes with college recruitment prospects. All had disappeared following team-related social events, and all had been receiving anonymous threats in the weeks prior to their disappearances. Margaret compiled her research into a comprehensive report that she submitted to Detective Coleman, the FBI, and the Michigan State Police, requesting that they reopen their investigation into Brennan with this new information. But her efforts were met with polite dismissal from agencies that were reluctant to pursue theories developed by a civilian investigator, particularly one whose emotional investment in the case might have compromised her objectivity. The rejection of her research by official law enforcement agencies marked a turning point in Margaret's approach to finding Jake. If the system wouldn't help her, she decided, she would work outside it. She began developing relationships with private investigators, retired police officers, and amateur sleuth communities that had emerged on early internet forums dedicated to unsolved crimes. Through these networks, Margaret learned about investigative techniques and resources that weren't available to small-town police departments. She discovered how to conduct background checks on individuals, how to obtain public records from multiple jurisdictions, and how to use emerging internet tools to track people's movements and activities across state lines. Most importantly, Margaret established contact with the families of Kevin Walsh and Marcus Johnson, beginning a collaboration that would eventually provide the evidence necessary to solve all 3 cases. The shared experience of losing their sons to an unknown predator created bonds between the families that transcended their geographic separation, and their combined resources and determination proved more effective than individual law enforcement efforts. By 2005, Margaret Morrison had become an unofficial expert on Thomas Brennan's movements and activities throughout the Midwest, tracking his employment history, residential addresses, and known associates with a thoroughness that impressed even professional investigators who had initially dismissed her theories. Her basement command center contained more information about Brennan than any single law enforcement agency possessed, creating a comprehensive profile of a man who had successfully evaded detection for over a decade. But Margaret's investigation had also revealed the personal cost of pursuing justice without official support or adequate resources. Her marriage to David had deteriorated beyond repair. Her relationship with surviving family members had become strained, and her health had suffered from years of stress and obsessive behavior. She had found her son's killer, but the knowledge had transformed her into someone she barely recognized, someone whose entire identity had become defined by a single, all-consuming quest for answers. The breakthrough that would finally solve Jake Morrison's disappearance came from an unexpected source in the summer of 2021, nearly 20 years after the star quarterback had vanished from Millfield. Detective Maria Santos, who had recently joined the cold case unit of the Michigan State Police, was reviewing unsolved missing persons files when she encountered Margaret Morrison's research on Thomas Brennan and the connection between multiple disappearances across the state. Santos had extensive experience with forensic genealogy, a revolutionary investigative technique that used DNA evidence in commercial genealogy databases to identify suspects through their genetic relationships to distant relatives. The technique had solved hundreds of cold cases nationwide, including several high-profile murders that had remained unsolved for decades. The blood evidence from Jake's car, which had been preserved in the Michigan State Police Evidence Storage Facility for 20 years, suddenly became relevant again as advancing DNA technology made it possible to extract usable genetic profiles from increasingly small and degraded samples. Santos submitted the evidence for enhanced DNA analysis, hoping to obtain a profile that could be compared against genealogy databases containing millions of consumer genetic submissions. The laboratory results that arrived in Santos's email on September 15, 2021, contained the genetic profile that would finally connect Thomas Brennan to Jake Morrison's disappearance. The enhanced DNA analysis had successfully extracted sufficient genetic markers from the blood drop to create a profile suitable for forensic genealogy research, providing the first concrete physical evidence linking a suspect to the crime scene. Santos began the painstaking process of building family trees around genetic matches in the genealogy databases, following branches of heredity through multiple generations to identify individuals who might be related to the unknown subject. The work required cross-referencing birth certificates, marriage records, census data, and immigration documents spanning over a century of American genealogical history. The genetic evidence pointed to a family tree that included Thomas Brennan as a potential match, but confirming his identity would require obtaining a comparison sample of his DNA for direct testing. Santos discovered that Brennan was living in Phoenix, Arizona, where he worked as a night security guard at a shopping mall, maintaining the same pattern of employment in positions that provided access to potential victims while avoiding scrutiny from colleagues or supervisors. Obtaining Brennan's DNA required careful planning and coordination with Arizona law enforcement officials who agreed to assist with surveillance and evidence collection. Santos arranged for undercover officers to collect discarded materials from Brennan's workplace, including coffee cups and cigarette butts that might contain sufficient genetic material for comparison testing. The laboratory confirmation arrived on October 13, 2021, exactly 20 years to the day after Jake Morrison's disappearance. The DNA profile from Thomas Brennan's discarded materials was a perfect match for the blood evidence found in Jake's car, providing conclusive proof of his involvement in the crime and justifying his arrest on charges of kidnapping and murder. Brennan's arrest at his Phoenix apartment occurred without incident, but his reaction to Detective Santos's questions revealed the psychological deterioration that 20 years of carrying murder secrets had inflicted on his mental state. The confident, manipulative coach who had terrorized Jake Morrison with anonymous threats had become a hollow, paranoid individual whose entire identity had been consumed by his crimes and the fear of eventually being caught. The confession that followed Brennan's arrest provided answers to questions that had haunted Millfield for 2 decades, but it also revealed the calculated nature of Jake's murder and the disposal of his body in ways that demonstrated Brennan's sophisticated understanding of criminal investigation techniques. Brennan explained that he had lured Jake to Miller's Creek on the night of October 13th by sending him a text message claiming to be from Ashley Chen, Jake's girlfriend, who was supposedly stranded there with car trouble. Jake's trusting nature and his devotion to Ashley made him respond immediately to what he believed was a request for help from the person he loved most. The actual murder had occurred at Miller's Creek, where Brennan had been waiting with a tire iron that he used to strike Jake in the head as soon as the young man approached what he thought was Ashley's car. The blood in Jake's Mustang had come from loading his unconscious body into the vehicle for transportation to a remote burial site that Brennan had prepared weeks earlier in anticipation of this moment. Jake's body had been buried in a deep grave in the Huron National Forest, approximately 75 miles from Millfield, at a location that Brennan had selected during reconnaissance trips that were disguised as camping expeditions. The site was far enough from populated areas to avoid accidental discovery, but accessible enough for Brennan to visit occasionally to ensure that the grave remained undisturbed. The confession provided closure for the Morrison family and the Millfield community, but it also revealed the extent to which Thomas Brennan's psychological pathology had driven him to commit multiple murders across several states. His admission of guilt in Jake's case opened investigations into the disappearances of Kevin Walsh and Marcus Johnson, cases that had remained unsolved for over 20 years, but could now be connected through DNA evidence in Brennan's detailed confessions. The arrest and conviction of Thomas Brennan brought an end to one of Michigan's most persistent missing persons cases, but it also highlighted the limitations of law enforcement resources and techniques that had allowed a serial killer to operate undetected for over a decade. Margaret Morrison's unofficial investigation had identified the correct suspect years before official agencies possessed the tools necessary to prove his guilt, demonstrating both the value of persistent advocacy and the importance of technological advances in solving cold cases. The recovery of Jake Morrison's remains from the Huron National Forest occurred on November 8, 2021, nearly 21 years after his disappearance, providing his family with the closure they had sought for more than 2 decades. The burial service that followed brought together hundreds of friends, teammates, and community members who had never stopped believing that Jake would eventually come home to Millfield, where his memory as a star quarterback and beloved young man would forever remain part of the town's identity and history. For those who followed this investigation from the beginning, Jake Morrison's story serves as a reminder that justice, when it finally arrives, often comes through the combination of advancing technology, persistent advocacy, and the refusal of those who love us to ever stop searching for the truth. The quarterback who vanished into an October night in 2001 was finally found, brought home, and laid to rest with the honors befitting a young man whose life was cut short by evil, but whose memory inspired a community to never give up hope.